Modern national India. Factors in the growth of modern nationalism. The rise and growth of Indian nationalism has been traditionally explained in terms of Indian response to the stimulus generated by the British Raj through creation of new institutions, new opportunities, resources, etc. In other words, Indian nationalism grew partly as a result of colonial policies and partly as a reaction to colonial policies. In fact, it would be more correct to see Indian nationalism as a product of a mix of various factors, i.e., worldwide upsurge of the concepts of nationalism and the right of self-determination initiated by the French Revolution, 2. Indian Renaissance. Unit 5. The struggle begins. Chapters 10 and 11. Beginning of modern nationalism in India 255. 3. Offshoot of modernization initiated by the British in India. 4. Strong reaction to British imperialist policies in India. Understanding of contradictions in Indian and colonial interests. People came to realize that colonial rule was the major cause of India's economic backwardness and that the interests of the Indians involved the interests of all sections and classes, peasants, artisans, handicraftsmen, workers, intellectuals, the educated, and the capitalists. The nationalist movement arose to take up the challenge of these contradictions inherent in the character and policies of colonial rule. Political, administrative, and economic unification of the country. The British rule in the Indian subcontinent extended from the Himalayas in the north to the Cape Comorin in the south and from Assam in the east to Khyber Pass in the west. While large areas of India had been brought under a single rule in the past, under the Mauryas or later under the Mughals, the British created a larger state than that of the Mauryas or the Great Mughals. While Indian provinces were under direct British rule, the princely states were under indirect British rule. The British sword imposed political unity in India. A professional civil service, a unified judiciary and codified civil and criminal laws throughout the length and breadth of the country imparted a new dimension of political unity to the hitherto cultural unity that had existed in India for centuries. The necessities of administrative convenience, considerations of military defense, and the urge for economic penetration and commercial exploitation, all in British interests, were the driving forces behind the planned development of modern means of transport and communication such as railways, roads, electricity, and telegraph. From the nationalists' point of view, this process of unification had a twofold effect, i.e., the economic fate of the people of different regions got linked together. For instance, failure of crops in one region affected the prices and supply in another region. 256. A brief history of modern India. 2. Modern means of transport and communication brought people, especially the leaders, from different regions together. This was important for the exchange of political ideas and for mobilization and organization of public opinion on political and economic issues. Western thought and education. The introduction of a modern system of education afforded opportunities for assimilation of modern Western ideas. This, in turn, gave a new direction to Indian political thinking, although the English system of education had been conceived by the rulers in the self-interest of efficient administration. The liberal and radical thought of European writers like Milton, Shelley, John Stuart Mill, Rousseau, Paine, Spencer and Voltaire helped many Indians imbibe modern rational, secular, democratic, and nationalist ideas. The English language helped nationalist leaders from different linguistic regions to communicate with each other. Those among the educated who took up liberal professions, lawyers, doctors, etc., often visited England for higher education. There they saw the working of modern political institutions in a free country and compared that system with the Indian situation where even basic rights were denied to the citizens. This ever-expanding English educated class formed the middle-class intelligentsia who constituted the nucleus for the newly arising political unrest. It was this section which provided leadership to the Indian political associations. Role of press and literature. The second half of the 19th century saw an unprecedented growth of Indian-owned English and vernacular newspapers, despite numerous restrictions imposed on the press by the colonial rulers from time to time. In 1877, there were about 169 newspapers published in vernacular languages and their circulation reached the neighborhood of 1 lakh. The press, while criticizing official policies, on the one hand, urged the people to unite, on the other. It also helped spread modern ideas of self-government, democracy, civil rights, and industrialization. The newspapers, journals, pamphlets, and nationalist literature helped in the exchange of political ideas among nationalist leaders from different regions. Beginning of modern nationalism in India 257. Rediscovery of India's past. The historical researches by European scholars, such as Max Muller, Monier Williams, Roth and Sassoon, and by Indian scholars such as R.G. Bhandakar, R.L. Mitra, and later Swami Vivekananda, created an entirely new picture of India's past. This picture was characterized by well-developed political, economic, and social institutions, a flourishing trade with the outside world, a rich heritage in arts and culture, and numerous cities. The theory put forward by European scholars, that the Indo-Aryans belonged to the same ethnic group from which other nations of Europe had evolved, gave a psychological boost to the educated Indians. The self-respect and confidence so gained helped the nationalists to demolish colonial myths that India had a long history of servility to foreign rulers. Progressive character of socio-religious reform movements. These reform movements sought to remove social evils which divided the Indian society. This had the effect of bringing different sections together and proved to be an important factor in the growth of Indian nationalism. Rise of middle-class intelligentsia. British administrative and economic innovations gave rise to a new urban middle class in towns. According to Percival Spear, the new middle class was a well-integrated all-India class with varied background but a common foreground of knowledge, ideas and values. It was a minority of Indian society, but a dynamic minority. It had a sense of unity of purpose and of hope. This class, prominent because of its education, new position, and its close ties with the ruling class, came to the forefront. The leadership to the Indian National Congress in all its stages of growth was provided by this class. Impact of contemporary movements in the world. Rise of a number of nations on the ruins of the Spanish and Portuguese empires in South America, and the national liberation movements of Greece and Italy in general and of Ireland in particular deeply influenced the nationalist ranks. 258 A brief history of modern India. Reactionary policies and racial arrogance of rulers. Racial myths of white superiority were sought to be perpetuated by the British through a deliberate policy of discrimination and segregation. Indians felt deeply hurt by this. Lytton's reactionary policies such as reduction of maximum age limit for the ICS examination from 21 years to 19 years, 1876, the Grand Delhi Darbar of 1877 when the country was in the severe grip of famine, the Vernacular Press Act, 1878, and the Arms Act, 1878, provoked a storm of opposition in the country. Then came the Ilbert Bill controversy. Ripon's government had sought to abolish judicial disqualification based on race distinctions, and to give the Indian members of the Covenanted Civil Service the same powers and rights as those enjoyed by their European colleagues. Ripon had to modify the bill, thus almost defeating the original purpose, because of the stiff opposition from the European community. It became clear to the nationalists that justice and fair play could not be expected where interests of the European community were involved. However, the organized agitation by the Europeans to revoke the Ilbert Bill also taught the nationalists how to agitate for certain rights and demands. Political associations before the Indian National Congress. The Indian National Congress was not the first political organization in India. However, most of the political associations in the early half of the 19th century were dominated by wealthy and aristocratic elements. They were local or regional in character. Through long petitions to the British Parliament, most of them demanded administrative reforms, association of Indians with the administration, and spread of education. The political associations of the second half of the 19th century came to be increasingly dominated by the educated middle class, the lawyers, journalists, doctors, teachers, etc., and they had a wider perspective and a larger agenda. Beginning of modern nationalism in India. 259. Political associations in Bengal. The Bangabharsha Prakasika Sabha was formed in 1836 by associates of Raja Ram Mohan Roy. The Zamindari Association, more popularly known as the Landholders' Society, was founded to safeguard the interests of the landlords. Although limited in its objectives, the Landholders' Society marked the beginning of an organized political activity and use of methods of constitutional agitation for the redressal of grievances. The Bengal British India Society was founded in 1843 with the object of the collection and dissemination of information relating to the actual condition of the people of British India, and to employ such other means of peaceful and lawful character as may appear calculated to secure the welfare, extend the just rights and advance the interests of all classes of our fellow subjects. In 1851, both the Landholders' Society and the Bengal British India Society merged into the British Indian Association. It sent a petition to the British Parliament demanding inclusion of some of its suggestions in the renewed charter of the company, such as I. Establishment of a separate legislature of a popular character, 2. Separation of executive from judicial functions, 3. Reduction in salaries of higher officers, and 4. Abolition of salt duty, abkari, and stamp duties. These were partially accepted when the Charter Act of 1853 provided for the addition of 6 members to the Governor-General's Council for legislative purposes. The East India Association was organized by Dadabhai Naoroji in 1866 in London to discuss the Indian question and influence public men in England to promote Indian welfare. Later, branches of the association were started in prominent Indian cities. The Indian League was started in 1875 by C.C. Kumar Ghosh with the object of stimulating the sense of nationalism amongst the people, and of encouraging political education. The Indian Association of Calcutta, also known as the Indian National Association, superseded the Indian 260. A brief history of modern India. League and was founded in 1876 by younger nationalists of Bengal led by Surendranath Banerjee and Ananda Mohan Bose, who were getting discontented with the conservative and pro-landlord policies of the British Indian Association. The Indian Association was the most important of pre-Congress associations and aimed to promote by every legitimate means the political, intellectual and material advancement of the people. It set out to I. Create a strong public opinion on political questions, and 2. Unify Indian people in a common political program. It protested against the reduction of age limit in 1877 for candidates of the Indian Civil Service examination. The association demanded simultaneous holding of civil service examination in England and India and Indianization of higher administrative posts. It led a campaign against the Repressive Arms Act and the Vernacular Press Act. Branches of the association were opened in other towns and cities of Bengal and even outside Bengal. The membership fee was kept low in order to attract the poorer sections to the association. The association sponsored an all-India conference which first took place in Calcutta from December 28 to 30, 1883. More than 100 delegates from different parts of the country attended. So, in a way, the association was a forerunner of the Indian National Congress as an all-India nationalist organization. It later merged with the Indian National Congress in 1886. Political associations in Bombay. The Pune Sarvajnik Sabha was founded in 1867 by Mahadev Govind Ranade and others, with the object of serving as a bridge between the government and the people. The Bombay Presidency Association was started by Badruddin Tyabji, Ferozeshah Mehta, and K.T. Tellon in 1885. Political associations in Madras. The Madras Mahajan Sabha was founded in 1884 by M. V. Raghvachari, also V. Raghvacharya, B. Subramania Iyer, and P. Ananda Chalu. Beginning of modern nationalism in India. 261. Pre-Congress campaigns. The associations organized various campaigns before the Indian National Congress appeared on the scene. These campaigns were I. For imposition of import duty on cotton, 1875, 2. For Indianization of government service, 1878-79, 3. Against Lytton's Afghan adventure, 4. Against Arms Act, 1878, v. Against Vernacular Press Act, 1878, 6. For right to join volunteer corps, 7. Against plantation labor and against Inland Immigration Act, 8. In support of Ilbert Bill, 9. For an all-India fund for political agitation, Kiss Smiley campaign in Britain to vote for Pro-India Party, 11. Against reduction in maximum age for appearing in Indian civil service, the Indian Association took up this question and organized an all-India agitation against it, popularly known as the Indian Civil Service Agitation. Summary. Factors in growth of modern nationalism. Understanding of contradictions in Indian and colonial interests. Political, administrative, and economic unification of the country. Western thought and education. Role of press and literature. Rediscovery of India's past. Historical researches. Rise of middle-class intelligentsia. Impact of contemporary movements. Worldwide reactionary policies and racial arrogance of rulers. Political associations before Indian National Congress. 1836, Bangabhasha Prakasika Sabha. Zamindari Association or Landholders Society. 1843, Bengal British India Society. 1851, British Indian Association. 1866, East India Association. 1870, Pune Sarvajnik Sabha. 1875, Indian League. 1876, Indian Association of Calcutta or Indian National Association. 1885, Bombay Presidency Association. 1884, Madras Mahajan Sabha. 262. A brief history of modern India. 262. Chapter 11. Indian National Congress. Foundation and the moderate phase. Foundation of the Indian National Congress. In the later 1870s and early 1880s, a solid ground had been prepared for the establishment of an all-India organization. The final shape to this idea was given by a retired English civil servant, A.O. Ham, who mobilized leading intellectuals of the time and, with their cooperation, organized the first session of the Indian National Congress at Gokul Das Tejpal Sanskrit College in Bombay in December 1885. As a prelude to this, 2 sessions of the Indian National Conference had been held in 1883 and 1885, which had representatives drawn from all major towns of India. Surendranath Banerjee and Ananda Mohan Bose were the main architects of the Indian National Conference. The first session of the Indian National Congress was attended by 72 delegates and presided over by Vimesh Chandra, or Chundar, Banerjee. Hereafter, the Congress met every year in December, in a different part of the country each time. Some of the great presidents of the Congress during this early phase were Dadabhai Naoroji, thrice Indian National Congress. 263. President, Badruddin Tyabji, Ferozeshah Mehta, P. Ananda Chalu, Surendranath Banerjee, Romesh Chandra Dutt, Ananda Mohan Bose, and Gopal Krishna Gokhale. Other prominent leaders included Mahadev Govind Ranade, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, C.C. Kumar Ghosh, Motilal Ghosh, Madan Mohan Malviya, G. Subramania Iyer, C. Vijay Gavacharya, Dinshaw Iwacha. In 1890, Kadambini Ganguly, the first woman graduate of Calcutta University, addressed the Congress session, which symbolized the commitment of the freedom struggle to give the women of India their due status in national life. Apart from the Indian National Congress, nationalist activity was carried out through provincial conferences and associations, newspapers, and literature. Was it a safety valve? There is a theory that Hum formed the Congress with the idea that it would prove to be a safety valve for releasing the growing discontent of the Indians. To this end, he convinced Lord Dufferin not to obstruct the formation of the Congress. The extremist leaders like Lala Lajpat Rai believed in the safety valve theory. Even the Marxist historians, conspiracy theory was an offspring of the safety valve notion. For example, R.P. Dutt opined that the Indian National Congress was born out of a conspiracy to abort a popular uprising in India and the bourgeois leaders were a party to it. Modern Indian historians, however, dispute the idea of safety valve. In their opinion, the Indian National Congress represented the urge of the politically conscious Indians to set up a national body to express the political and economic demands of the Indians. If the Indians had convened such a body on their own, there would have been unsurmountable opposition from the officials. Such an organization would not have been allowed to form. In the circumstances, as Bipan Chandra observes, the early Congress leaders used Hum as a lightning conductor, i.e., as a catalyst to bring together the nationalistic forces even if under the guise of a safety valve. 264. A brief history of modern India. Aims and objectives of the Congress. The main aims of the Indian National Congress in the initial stage were to I. Found a democratic, nationalist movement. 2. Politicize and politically educate people. 3. Establish the headquarters for a movement. 4. Promote friendly relations among nationalist political workers from different parts of the country. We. Develop and propagate an anti-colonial nationalist ideology. 6. Formulate and present popular demands before the government with a view to unifying the people over a common economic and political program. 7. Develop and consolidate a feeling of national unity among people irrespective of religion, caste, or province. 8. Carefully promote and nurture Indian nationhood. Era of moderates, 1885-1905. Important leaders. The national leaders like Dadabhai Naoroji, Feroze Shah Mehta, D.E. Wacha, W.C. Banerjee, S.N. Banerjee, who dominated the Congress policies during the early period, 1885-1905, were staunch believers in liberalism and moderate politics and came to be labeled as moderates to distinguish them from the neo-nationalists of the early 20th century who were referred to as the extremists. Moderate approach. The moderate political activity involved constitutional agitation within the confines of law and showed a slow but orderly political progress. The moderates believed that the British basically wanted to be just to the Indians but were not aware of the real conditions. Therefore, if public opinion could be created in the country and public demands be presented to the government through resolutions, petitions, meetings, etc., the authorities would concede these demands gradually. Indian National Congress 265. To achieve these ends, they worked on a two-pronged methodology. 1. Create a strong public opinion to arouse consciousness and national spirit and then educate and unite people on common political questions. And 2. Persuade the British government and British public opinion to introduce reforms in India on the lines laid out by the nationalists. They used the method of prayer and petition, and if that failed, they resorted to constitutional agitation. A British committee of the Indian National Congress was established in London in 1889 which had India as its organ. Dadabhai Naoroji spent a substantial portion of his life and income campaigning for India's case abroad. In 1890, it was decided to hold a session of the Indian National Congress in London in 1892, but owing to the British elections of 1891 the proposal was postponed and never revived later. The moderate leaders believed that political connections with Britain were in India's interest at that stage of history, and that the time was not ripe for a direct challenge to the British rule. Therefore, it was considered to be appropriate to try and transform the colonial rule to be as close to a national rule as possible. Contributions of moderate nationalists. Economic critique of British imperialism. The early nationalists, led by Dadabhai Naoroji, R.C. Dutt, Dinshaw Wacha and others, carefully analysed the political economy of British rule in India, and put forward the drain theory to explain British exploitation of India. They opposed the transformation of a basically self-sufficient Indian economy into a colonial economy, i.e., a supplier of raw materials and foodstuff, an importer of finished goods and a field of investment for British capital. Thus, the moderates were able to create an all-India public opinion that British rule in India was the major cause of India's poverty and economic backwardness, to mitigate the deprivation characterizing Indian life. 266. A brief history of modern India. The early nationalists demanded severance of India's economic subservience to Britain and development of an independent economy through involvement of Indian capital and enterprise. The early nationalists demanded reduction in land revenue, abolition of salt tax, improvement in working conditions of plantation labor, reduction in military expenditure, and encouragement to modern industry through tariff protection and direct government aid. Also refer to chapter on economic impact of British rule in India. Constitutional reforms and propaganda in legislative councils in India had no real official power till 1920. Yet, work done in them by the nationalists helped the growth of the national movement. The Imperial Legislative Council constituted by the Indian Councils Act, 1861, was an important body designed to disguise official measures as having been passed by a representative body. Indian members were few in number. In the 30 years from 1862 to 1892 only 45 Indians were nominated to it, most of them being wealthy, landed, and with loyalist interests. Only a handful of political figures and independent intellectuals such as Syed Ahmed Khan, Christo Das Pal, V.N. Mandalik, K.L. Nulkar, and Rash Bihari Ghosh, also written as Rash Bihari Gosai, were among those nominated. From 1885 to 1892, the nationalist demands for constitutional reforms were centered around I. Expansion of councils, i.e., greater participation of Indians in councils, and 2. Reform of councils, i.e., more powers to councils, especially greater control over finances. The early nationalists worked with the long-term objective of a democratic self-government. Their demands for constitutional reforms were meant to have been conceded in 1892 in the form of the Indian Councils Act. These reforms were severely criticized at Congress sessions, where the nationalists made no secret of their dissatisfaction with them. Now, they demanded I. A majority of elected Indians, and 2. Control over the budget, i.e., the power to vote upon and amend the budget. They gave the Indian National Congress 267 slogan, No taxation without representation. Gradually, the scope of constitutional demands was widened. Dadabhai Naoroji, 1904, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, 1905, and Lokmanya Tilak, 1906, demanded self-government on the lines of the self-governing colonies of Canada and Australia. Also, leaders like Ferozeshah Mehta and Gokhale put government policies and proposals to severe criticism. The British had intended to use the councils to incorporate the more vocal among Indian leaders, so as to allow them to let off their political steam, while the impotent councils could afford to remain deaf to their criticism. But the nationalists were able to transform these councils into forums for ventilating popular grievances, for exposing the defects of an indifferent bureaucracy, for criticizing government policies proposals, raising basic economic issues, especially regarding public finance. Indian Councils Act, 1892. Main provisions: number of additional members in Imperial Legislative Councils and the Provincial Legislative Councils was raised. In Imperial Legislative Council, now the Governor-General could have 10 to 16 non-officials, instead of 6 to 10 previously. The non-official members of the Indian Legislative Council were to be nominated by the Bengal Chamber of Commerce and Provincial Legislative Councils. The members could be recommended by universities, municipalities, zemindars, and chambers of commerce. So, the principle of representation was introduced. Budget could be discussed. Questions could be asked. Limitations: the officials retained their majority in the council, thus making ineffective the non-official voice. The reformed Imperial Legislative Council met, during its tenure till 1909, on an average for only 13 days in a year, and the number of unofficial Indian members present was only 5 out of 24. The budget could not be voted upon, nor could any amendments be made to it. Supplementaries could not be asked, nor could answers to any question be discussed. 268. A brief history of modern India. The nationalists were, thus, able to enhance their political stature and build a national movement while undermining the political and moral influence of imperialist rule. This helped in generating anti-imperialist sentiments among the public. But, at the same time, the nationalists failed to widen the democratic base of the movement by not including the masses, especially women, and not demanding the right to vote for all. Campaign for general administrative reforms. The moderates campaigned on the following grounds: I. Indianization of government service, on the economic grounds that British civil servants got very high emoluments while inclusion of Indians would be more economical, on political grounds that, since salaries of British bureaucrats were remitted back home and pensions paid in England, all drawn from Indian revenue, this amounted to economic drain of national resources, and on moral grounds that Indians were being discriminated against by being kept away from positions of trust and responsibility. 2. Call for separation of judicial from executive functions. 3. Criticism of an oppressive and tyrannical bureaucracy and an expensive and time-consuming judicial system. 4. Criticism of an aggressive foreign policy which resulted in annexation of Burma, attack on Afghanistan, and suppression of T-BILS in the northwest, all costing heavily for the Indian treasury. We call for increase in expenditure on welfare, i.e. health, sanitation, education, especially elementary and technical, irrigation works and improvement of agriculture, agricultural banks for cultivators, etc. 6. Demand for better treatment for Indian labour abroad in other British colonies, where they faced oppression and racial discrimination. Protection of civil rights. Civil rights included the right to speech, thought, association, and a free press. Through an incessant campaign, the nationalists, Indian National Congress 269, were able to spread modern democratic ideas, and soon the defence of civil rights became an integral part of the freedom struggle. It was due to the increased consciousness that there was a great public outrage at the arrest of Tilak and several other leaders and journalists in 1897 and at the arrest and deportation of the Nehru brothers without a trial. Also refer to chapter on development of press in India. An evaluation of the early nationalists. The early nationalists did a great deal to awaken the national sentiment, even though they could not draw the masses to them. They represented the most progressive forces of the time. 2. They were able to create a wide national awakening of all Indians having common interests and the need to rally around a common program against a common enemy, and above all, the feeling of belonging to one nation. 3. They trained people in political work and popularized modern ideas. 4. They exposed the basically exploitative character of colonial rule, thus undermining its moral foundations. Their political work was based on hard realities, and not on shallow sentiments, religion, etc. 6. They were able to establish the basic political truth that India should be ruled in the interest of Indians. 7. They created a solid base for a more vigorous, militant, mass-based national movement in the years that followed. 8. However, they failed to widen their democratic base and the scope of their demands. Views. You don't realize our place in the history of our country. These memorials are nominally addressed to the government. In reality they are addressed to the people, so that they may learn how to think in these matters. This work must be done for many years, without expecting any other results, because politics of this kind is altogether new in this land. Justice Mahadev Govind Ranade to Gokhale, 1891. 270. A brief history of modern India. Role of masses. The moderate phase of the national movement had a narrow social base and the masses played a passive role. This was because the early nationalists lacked political faith in the masses. They felt that there were numerous divisions and subdivisions in the Indian society, and the masses were generally ignorant and had conservative ideas and thoughts. The moderates felt that these heterogeneous elements had first to be welded into a nation before they entered the political sphere. But they failed to realize that it was only during a freedom struggle and with political participation that these diverse elements could come together. Because of the lack of mass participation, the moderates could not take militant political positions against the authorities. The later nationalists differed from the moderates precisely on this point. Still, the early nationalists represented the emerging Indian nation against colonial interests. Views. We cannot blame them for the attitude they adopted as pioneers of Indian political reform any more than we can blame the brick and mortar that is buried 6 feet deep in the foundation and plinth of a modern edifice. They have made possible the superstructure, story by story, by colonial self-government, home rule within the empire, Swaraj, and on the top of all, complete independence. Pattabhi Sitaramaya, the period from 1858 to 1905 was the seed time of Indian nationalism, and the early nationalists sowed the seeds well and deep. Bipin Chandra, it was at best an opportunist movement. It opened opportunities for treacheries and hypocrisies. It enabled some people to trade in the name of patriotism. Lala Lajpat Rai attitude of the government. The British Indian government was hostile to the Congress from the beginning despite the latter's moderate methods and emphasis on loyalty to the British Crown. The official attitude stiffened further after 1887 when the government failed to persuade the Congress to confine itself to social issues when the Congress was becoming increasingly critical. Indian National Congress 271. Views. The Congress is tottering to its fall, and one of my great ambitions while in India is to assist it to a peaceful demise. Lord Curzon, 1900. Of the colonial rule. Now, the government resorted to open condemnation of the Congress, calling the nationalists, seditious Brahmins, disloyal Babus, etc. Duffering called the Congress a factory of sedition. Later, the government adopted a divide and rule policy towards the Congress. The officials encouraged reactionary elements like Sir Syed Ahmed Khan and Raja Shiv Prasad Singh of Banaras to organize the United Indian Patriotic Association to counter Congress propaganda. The government also tried to divide the nationalists on the basis of religion, and, through a policy of carrot and stick, pitted the moderates against the extremists. But the government failed to check the rising tide of nationalism. Summary. Foundation of Indian National Congress. First session held in 1885, Bombay. Indian National Union, formed by A.O. Ham, became Indian National Congress. Foundational theories of INC and prominent believers: safety valve theory, Lala Lajpat Rai conspiracy theory, R.P. Dutt lightning conductor theory, G.K. Gokhale. Important leaders of moderate phase: Dadabhai Nauroji, Badruddin Tyabji, Ferozesha Mehta, P. Ananda Chalu, Surendranath Banerjee, Romesh Chandra Dutt, Ananda Mohan Bose, G.K. Gokhale, etc. Early nationalist methodology: constitutional agitation within 4 walls of law, create public opinion in India and campaign for support to Indian demands in England. Political education of people, political connections with Britain in India's interests at that stage, time not ripe for direct challenge to colonial rule. Contributions of moderate nationalists: economic critique of British imperialism, constitutional reforms and propaganda in legislature. Campaign for general administrative reforms. Defense of civil rights. 272 A brief history of modern India. Chapter 12. Era of militant